Hey guys, Miss Raymond here, and today for math we're going to talk about square roots and how to find them. All right. Okay, so what's a square root? The square root of a number is a different number that when multiplied by itself results in the original number. So the square root of 64 is 8 because 8 times 8 equals 64. So the square root of 64 equals 8. All right, so we're going to watch a video clip about this, and then we're going to do some examples.
Anthony here, and on this lesson we get to visually explore that relationship between square roots and perfect squares. So we really get to visually explore that question, what exactly is a square root? Let's go ahead and take a look. Hey everyone, welcome back to this introductory lesson on square roots and perfect squares. So we are going to start off our discussion by looking at a rectangle, and this rectangle has a width of 4 units and a length of 8 units. Now we're going to envision this in terms of area. So that width of 4, think of that as 4 equal size units that will split it up along the width. And then for the length, we have 8 equal size units, which we will split it up along the length. And now we have these squares that make up the inside, the area of that figure. Length times width, in this case 4 times 8, which we know is 32. So the area of this rectangle is 32 square units. So now let's look at what would happen if we cut this rectangle in half. So now instead of it being a 4 by 8 rectangle, it's a 4 by 4, which makes it a square since all of the sides have the same length. The area of this square, 4 times 4, we know is equal to 16 square units. And this relationship allows us to say that 16 is a perfect square, and also that the square root of 16 is 4, since 4 squared equals 16. And we can think of this relationship every time we think about perfect squares. Now, for example, if we took this 4 by 4 square and cut each unit in half to make it 8 by 8, now if we counted up all those squares to find the area, or just multiplied 8 by 8, 8 squared, we would get a result of 64 square units. So 64 is also a perfect square, and the square root of 64 is 8, because 8 squared will equal 64. So now we can say that a perfect square is a number that can be made by multiplying a whole number by itself, by squaring any whole number.
Cool.
So now we can revisit the two perfect squares from earlier, and that was the 4 by 4 square and the 8 by 8 square. Now 4 times 4, if we think of this in terms of area, is 16, which is equal to 4 squared. And 8 times 8 is equal to 64, which we know is equal to 8 squared. Notice again that 4 and 8 are both whole numbers. Now if we take the square root of 16, our result is 4. And if we take the square root of 64, our result is 8. So the most important thing to take away from this lesson is that relationship between a perfect square and its square root. And now we can explore that relationship a little bit more. Let's take a look at an example of a perfect square of 25 and a non-perfect square, 30. Now 25 is a perfect square because 25 is equal to 5 squared. And the square root of 25 is equal to 5, which is a whole number, so by definition, everything works out. A non-perfect square, 30, if I take the square root of 30, I get approximately 5.48, which of course is not a whole number. So there is no whole number that we can square to get to 30 the way that we can square 5 to get to 25. Now 25 and 30 are pretty close to each other in value. And if we think about these two numbers in terms of area, again, we know that 25 is a perfect square that has dimensions 5 by 5. And if we think about that area in comparison to that 30, if we slide it over, we see that it kind of fits but there is some room left over, that orange space, which doesn't quite hold one full square. It only holds about half of a square, which is where that 0.48, that decimal, comes from. And again, this is because there is no whole number that we can square to get to 30. We'd have to have a decimal value in order to approximate a square root for a number like 30. So now we're going to go ahead and visually explore some of the most common perfect squares and their relationship to their square root. So 1 squared is 1 times 1, which just equals 1. 2 squared is 2 times 2, which equals 4. 3 squared is 3 times 3, which equals 9. 4 squared, again, 4 times 4, which equals 16. Again, these are all perfect squares. 5 squared is 25. 6 squared, 6 times 6 equals 36. 7 squared is 7 times 7, which equals 49. 8 squared is 8 times 8, which equals 64. We actually looked at that one earlier. And 9 squared, 9 times 9, is equal to 81. And the square root for each one of these perfect squares is the value that you had to square to get it in the first place. So for example, the square root of 4 is equal to 2. The square root of 9 is equal to 3. The square root of 16 is equal to 4, and so on and so forth. And this is why raising a number to the second power, or the power of 2, is referred to as squaring the number. So those are the basic concepts involved with perfect squares and square roots. So keep that in mind as you continue to build upon that understanding and apply it to algebra and more advanced levels of mathematics.
All right, so hopefully that helped a little bit with understanding what we mean by square root of a number and a perfect square. So I'm just gonna review. Again, the square root of a number is a number that when multiplied by itself equals the given number. A perfect square is a number with integers as its square roots. So here's an example. Example 1, finding square roots of a perfect square. It says find the positive square root of 36. So we know that 6 times 6 gives us 36, right? So the positive square root of 36 is 6, okay? The symbol right here is called a radical sign. It is used to represent a square root. The number under the radical sign is called the radicand, okay? So here's your square root symbol, and any number under here is known as the radicand. So the square, this means the square root of 36 equals 6. All right, we're gonna look at a tutorial to help further explain that. Okay, and this is from our Big Ideas Math book that we use in class, all right?
Find the positive square root of 64. 8 times 8 equals 64. So the positive square root of 64 is 8.
All right, now we're gonna look at example 2, finding square roots. All right, so find the square root. Find the square root of 81, because remember that symbol means square root. Let me use my pen, so this is your square root symbol. So it says to find the square root of 81. It tells us that this represents the positive square root. So because we know that 9 squared, or 9 times 9, right, equals 81, right? Then the square root of 81, right? It's the same thing as 9 squared, which is equal to 9, okay? So that means that the square root of 81 is equal, okay, to 9 squared, all right, which is equal to 9, okay? All right, we will look at another tutorial, and then we're going to do some practice, okay? Oops.
Find the square root. A. The square root of 144. Because 12 squared equals 144, the square root of 144 equals the square root of 12 squared, which equals 12. So the square root of 144 equals 12. B. The square root of 625. Because 25 squared equals 625, the square root of 625 equals the square root of 25 squared, which equals 25. So the square root of 625 equals 25.
All right, so we're going to do some practice together. So the directions say to find the positive square root of the number. Let me get my pen. Okay, so problem number 1 is 49. All right, so we think about multiplication. We know that 7 times 7 equals 49, right? Okay, so if we need to find the positive square root of the number, right, we are going to look back at 7 times 7 equals 49, right? So that must mean that the square root of 49 is going to be equal to 7, right? Because 7 times 7 gives us 49, okay? All right, so for problem number 2, 64, okay? So I want you to try that one and then we'll go over it. If you need to pause and get a calculator, that's fine, you may do that. You can go ahead and do that now. All right. Again, we're trying to find the positive square root of the number. So the number is 64. I think back to, well, I know that 8 times 8 is equal to 64, right? So that must mean that positive square root of 64 is going to be equal to 8, right? Because I know that 8 times 8 gave me 64, okay? There's another one for you to try. Find the positive square root of 144. Again, you may pause the recording so you can practice, okay? So you go ahead and do that, and then I'm going to go over it, okay? I'll give you a minute to try. All right, so 144, I remember my multiplication facts. So I remember that 12 times 12 gives me 144, right? So then if I'm trying to find the square root of 144, I'm going to look back up here and see that 12 times itself, 12 times 12 gave me 144. So I know the square root of 144 is going to be 12, right? Go to 12. All right. Let me go ahead and pause here. All right, let's do a few more practice problems. Find the square root of 121, okay? So let me get my pen here. So I know, and if you need to use a calculator, you can, but if you know your multiplication facts, then you can think of this in terms of, well, I know that 11 squared gives me 121, right? So 11 times 11, you can check it on your calculator, right, gives me 121. So, whoops. So I know then that the square root of 121, right, is going to be 11, because 11 times 11 gives me 21. So the square root of 121 would be 11, okay? Why don't you give number 5 a try, and then we'll go over it, okay? If you need to pause the recording, I would suggest doing that and trying it, and then we can go over it, all right? I'm seeing that I need to find the square root of 196, right? So I know, excuse me, that 14 squared gives me 196, right? So if I'm trying to find the square root of 196, that's like saying, right, square root of 14 squared, which would be 14, right? Because we know that 14 times 14, right, gives me 196. So the square root of 196 would be 14. Okay, one more problem. You can try it and pause the video, and then you can check to see if you get it correct. Okay, so we're trying to find the square root of 289. Okay, you can use your calculator if you need to. But I know that 17 squared, which is the same thing as 17 times 17, right? That gives me 289. So that means that the square root of 289 is going to be 17. Okay. All right, so you should have you will be receiving in the mail some work, and included in that is going to be practice on square roots. So you can work on that, practicing that some tomorrow. All right, that's all I have for today.